Have you ever walked into a place and felt like you stepped into another time? What if, just for a moment, the past or future became your present? Could time be more fluid than we think, allowing us to slip between moments without warning? Welcome to a new episode of the Magical Professions podcast, where we delve today into the mysteries of time slips. Those strange moments when people report accidentally stepping into the past or glimpsing into the future, only to return as if nothing happened. Today, we're joined by John Olsen, a renowned paranormal researcher and author of the Stranger Bridgerland series. Over the years, John has collected countless first-hand accounts on unexplained events, including ghostly encounters, glitching in the matrix, and reports of time behaving in ways that defy logic. In this episode, we will explore what are time slips and could they reveal a hidden profession within the magical reality, those who navigate, control, or unknowingly experience distortions in time. What stories has John uncovered from people who claim to have slipped through time? And do these experiences suggest the existence of time benders, individuals with the unique connections to time anomalies? Are time slips mere tricks of perception, paranormal phenomena, or evidence that time is more fluid than we assume? Could there be those who work knowingly or unknowingly as intermediaries between different timelines? So join us as we unravel the mystery of time slips through the lens of magical professions. Welcome, John, to our podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Can you please briefly introduce yourself and let our listeners know where you're joining us from what part of the world? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is John Olsen, and as you said, I'm the author of the Stranger Bridgerland book series, and I'm a researcher, and I just love the paranormal. A little bit of my background, I grew up in a home that was built in 1883. I live in northern Utah. That's where I was born and raised, and I still live there. But as I grew up in this home, I realized that it was very paranormally active, the home. I had a lot of experiences as a kid, and it got me very interested in the paranormal. And before long, by the time I was a teenager, I was telling stories and collecting stories, and I've been studying the paranormal ever since then, just collecting stories from all different realms of the paranormal, but also, as you said, people who have experienced weird time slips. The whole thing is very fascinating to me.
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating. And how would you define paranormal?
So to me, the paranormal is anything that cannot be defined by science.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there may be something that somebody's having that eventually is explained. They've hit their head or something like that. And so it eventually was explained. But to me, the paranormal is anything that can't be explained fully by science yet.
And as we have Magical Professions podcast, how do you define magic? What is magic to you?
So magic to me, it's an underlying current that runs through the universe and it runs through us. Not to sound too corny, but it would be similar to the Force in Star Wars or something of that nature, where it gives power to different things and different people. Everyone has different gifts in their life. And I believe that's basically where magic comes from, is that flow through everyone. And some people are just a lot better at being able to interact with that energy that's out there in the world. And so it's where you would get, somebody who's very good at magic or very good at something of that nature, because they're able to tap into that power.
And what is this connection for you between paranormal and magical?
So to me, the connection is almost the same as it is with anything in the world. For example, not to sound bad, but magic to me can affect everything, even for someone who happens to be fantastic at growing a garden for whatever reason. They have that gift. And in the same way, they're able to use that gift to be an extraordinary gardener or be an extraordinary woodworker and be able to bring out beauty out of woodworking, is the same way that magic works through the paranormal as well. There's people out there that have gifts through, whatever means, that they're able to see spirits or divine spirits, whether they're good or bad, or if they have bad intentions. So to me, it's the same kind of thing as anything else, just people's abilities and how they are able to connect to the magic or the energy around us.
Thank you. And you mentioned living in North Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And from your last book that I saw, you actually wrote about paranormal activity specifically in Utah. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
So it was your last book called Stranger Utah, True Paranormal Stories from Utah.
Yes.
I always like to give listeners a sense from where the person is, because I think it defines us in certain way, where we are growing, where we are living. Can you maybe share one thing in paranormal space about Utah?
Yes, it's amazing living in Utah, and I was raised here in Utah. In northern Utah, where I live, it's called Cache Valley, and I think it's very paranormally active, but a lot of places are very paranormally active. But the one thing that I've noticed about Utah is, because of the connection that I have with the outdoors and the wilderness, because growing up, here in the valley, in Cache Valley, I've always been a bicycle ride or, a short walk from the mountains. I live really close to the mountains even now. And because of that, I think that a lot of the stories I get and a lot of the people that I interview, the paranormal stories seem to be attached to the wilderness and the outdoors. And I interview a lot of people in Utah and other places that were just out for a hike, or they were out fishing, or just out to be out in the wilderness, and then run into the paranormal. In fact, most of the stories that I collect is amazing, because it's not somebody who was out ghost hunting or looking for the paranormal. They just happen to run into the paranormal for whatever reason. And so definitely here in Utah, that's part of it. The fact that it's got a lot of wilderness and a lot of history in the Native Americans, with the Navajo and the Anasazi in southern Utah. And so, yeah, it's just got a rich history of the paranormal here.
Thank you. From your interviews, and I listened to some of your interviews, I really liked your outlook on paranormal. At least to me, it sounds very positive. I don't feel any fear. And I think that's very important, to be open, not to fear things. And that also gives you a power to research it, to investigate it, to look at it without having any barriers. And I remember in one of the interviews, you said that, for example, hosts, they're mostly benevolent, and only very small proportions of them, can cause harm and whatnot. So I really, really admire this outlook on things. And maybe you can provide some advice, some suggestions for other people how to look at the paranormal events without fear.
Yes, exactly. It's amazing to me that because of what I do get the opportunity to help people who are having interactions with the paranormal. And a lot of times when I go in and I talk to the people and we go through things, I like to explain that my favorite saying, at least is with ghosts, is that ghosts are just people that used to be alive that aren't anymore. And if you were to walk down the street and meet 10 people, 9 out of the 10 people would be normal, good, nice people. It's that 10th person that you might have to worry about who might be a jerk. And it's the same with people who have passed on with ghosts, because if they were a nice person in life, then more than likely they're a nice person in the afterlife, I guess you could say. And one thing that I've noticed when I help people who come to me and they say, I think I have a spirit in my home. I think, we're having an interaction. The vast majority of it, after we're able to come in and eliminate the normal things, weird sounds in the house that they didn't recognize or something like that, the biggest thing that I tell people is to just be very vocal and say, this is my home now. I understand that you were here before. You're okay to be here, but just know that what you're doing is scaring me or it's scaring the children. And if you could please not do that. It's amazing how many times just being vocal works with them. A couple of years ago, I had an instance where I was contacted by a family and they had a little girl who was 4 at the time. And she was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning screaming about the man in her room, and they needed some help. And so we went in and I went in, and the first thing I did was I said, take her to the doctor, see if she's not having night terrors or there's something like that. And they took her in and everything was normal, because often it's funny. People don't realize that a bladder infection in a child or an older person can cause delusions. But everything was clear. And so we did some research and I had a group come in and do it and talk to them and try and actually, get some information about the ghosts. And because they were living in an apartment, which doesn't normally have ghosts in an apartment, a newer apartment. But after doing research and finding all this out and finding the picture, it come to find out that the little girl was actually adopted, and it was her grandfather from her biological father's dad. So her grandfather on that side, who had passed away and was just coming in to check on her and didn't realize he was scaring her when he did that. And so it just took the parents being vocal at night to say, hey, it's okay if you check on her, but don't let her see you because it's scaring her really bad. And it all went away. It just went away in almost instantly. So to me, especially when it comes to ghosts, if you're going to do research or you're going to do whatever it is, if you can realize that most of them are just people who've passed on and they're just people like you and treat them that way, then you usually get some good results from what you would like. So,
Yes, I like this approach. And in addition to studying paranormal and hosts, you also were studying some glitches in the Matrix. And I think this is where the time sleep interest came from. Can you tell more about that?
Yes. So it's funny that when I started gathering stories, I started getting these stories that really didn't fall under any other category. They were just weird or strange and just out there. And so I started labeling them glitches in the Matrix from the movie The Matrix. And it's fascinating to me how they seem to be more and more stories that I am collecting as well. And some of them have to do with people. They remember things differently than they are now. For example, people who remember a neighbor's house. I'll just tell this story really quick. There was a gentleman, he grew up in Missouri and he lived in a small town, and there was a small field between him and another house, but it was an old farmhouse. And when he was a young teenager, an older couple came and bought that house, and then they remodeled the house. They completely restored the house. And he remembered that the newspaper came and interviewed him and took pictures. He spent his high school career mowing this older couple's lawn, and just he remembered how much he loved that house. And years and years later, happened to be passing through that town with his family. And he was like, oh, let's see, I'll show you where my old house was and all this. And as he was showing him his old house, where this old farmhouse that had been restored was gone, and there was a brand new house sitting on the lot. And he thought, oh, I wonder if it burned down or something happened. So, he knocked on the door, and a younger lady came to the door, and he asked her about it. And she's like, oh, no, my parents bought the property but way back in the day, but they decided to demolish the house and build a new one. And he's like, I remember your parents, and that's not how it was. I remember them restoring the building. And he even went to the archives in the little town library and even asking his family members. All of his family members remember that they knocked down the old house and built a new one, but he remembers that they restored the old one, and he has vivid memories about that. So a lot of those stories, like I said, a lot of the glitches of the Matrix has to do with people remembering history different than what it is now, almost like personal Mandela effects, if you've studied the Mandela effects. But along with that has come these stories of people who see glimpses of the past in different ways, or it's almost broken down into two categories. One category where people suddenly find themselves back in a different time period, but the people around them cannot hear them or interact with them. And then also stories where people go back, but they actually are able to interact with people in the past, which is fascinating to me. One story that I've collected is in one of my books that I love. A gentleman who gone hunting, and the particular place where he hunted was up in the mountain where he could see the valley where he lived, including the town that he lived. And he'd gone up, and it had been raining in the morning, and he was sitting waiting for the clouds to clear so that he could see. And when the clouds parted, he could see the valley, but it was no longer the valley that he remembered. He couldn't see his town. He couldn't see the highway or anything. And he pulled up his binoculars and looked. There was a few small ranches with older buildings with smoke coming out of it. In the very far distance, he could see some sort of military camp with tents and everything. And he was really confused. He thought, did I get lost? Am I somewhere I'm not supposed to be? And then the clouds came back in and then left. And then when they parted for the second time and cleared for the day, the valley was back to the normal. It was back to what he remembered with it. And doing some research, that was what that valley looked like back in the 1800s at some point, where there was just a few ranches and then a military camp on the other side of the valley. And that's what he could see. So to me, that's really fascinating, because it makes me wonder if there isn't portals out there or something going along with physics that allow us to accidentally fall through time at times, and how that works. It's amazing. I just know that from everybody that I've interviewed and everybody that I've read about, there's no way that there isn't something really powerful going on with that.
Yes, that is a very interesting experience. And as you said, there are many stories like that. What are current explanations of those phenomena?
I don't know if there is any current explanations for it. I will say this. I do love following current science and things that they're finding out. And I do not claim whatsoever to be any sort of scientist, or let alone a physics scientist. But the more that I read about quantum physics, the more I realize that there are things out there that we don't know or can't possibly understand, because there's even things in physics that science can't explain. For example, one of my favorites that I talk to people about is there's an experiment that they do. It's called the double slit experiment, where they send light through these double slits, and they're supposed to interact a certain way. Like if you were throwing tennis balls at the wall, they would come through and make a sporadic pattern. But it changes between a light source and a physical source depending upon whether you're looking at it or not. And that's the only difference, is whether you're looking at it or not. So it's really something fascinating, because I think it leads to the fact that there is so much more out there that we don't understand than what we do understand at this point. So some of the ideas that I have and some of the thoughts are the fact that there could be basically what you would call miniature wormholes out there for whatever reason. And people walk through them unknowingly and then eventually are drawn back through. People's experiences can last from just 10 seconds to, there are stories of people who have been lost back in that time frame for overnight or for hours trying to find their way back, which also makes me wonder how many people have slipped through and never been able to come back, which would be really frightening.
Absolutely. And certain things, for example, if we would look from the perspective of, let's say, cognitive psychology, memory, there is the whole field of false memory. Our memory is really very, very fragile. It's very susceptible to changes. Before we thought that it's like a machine, we wrote something like on a hard drive and it stays there unchanged. It's not true. It's changing all the time. We retrieve that memory and based on our experience and whatnot. So memories can be changed, and some people might explain those phenomena that are happening about the past time slips with that. But I'm very curious if there are any records of time slips into the future, which would be more maybe indicative of those type of wormholes and without so much impact of memory. I'm just trying to reason.
Right.
Yes. What do you think?
No,
Yeah.
I have collected a few stories like that. I haven't actually had a chance to write those up, but I can give you a few references to that. I know that there was a story of a gentleman who kept a diary, and through the generations, this diary had been passed on, but nobody really paid much attention to it. He was an original settler to Utah. And one of the stories that he wrote in there was of him going here in Cache Valley, settled by the Mormons and the LDS. And so he was LDS and had come through and settled with the Mormons here in the valley. And when they were constructing the temple and he was helping construct the temple, he had gone up onto the hill one day when it wasn't his turn to work and sat there. And in his diary, he had written about sitting there, and all of a sudden, it was almost like a curtain had rolled past him, and he could see the valley was full of houses and full of things. And there were weird things like traveling the roads and just the immense amount of people. And he was very taken back by that. And there were things that he really couldn't explain at that point, which I imagine might have been airplanes or cars or who knows. And it only lasted a few minutes and then it rolled back again. But as he wrote it, it came off more of a religious experience. But if you look at it from stepping back and kind of as a scientific thing, it definitely looks like he was looking into the future and seeing the valley at this time where there's a lot more vehicles and a lot more people. So it's fascinating for sure. There's other stories as well, not that I've collected, but I've studied about people who woke up really far into the future and interacted with the people and talked to them about wars that had happened, and they were able to come back from almost being destroyed. And then eventually he returned to this time with the story of, yeah, we need to be better about doing this and better about taking care of the earth and ourselves. And it's really kind of fascinating. There was a video, and I don't know if this is a real video or not. It's just one that I found really interesting. This gentleman who was at home, and in the video, and I have to look it up because I'm not sure what it's called, somehow he went through a cupboard at his house and ended up in the future and met himself as an old man. And they had video of it, them together. They both had the same tattoo. They both talked, and then he came back. Even if that's not true and it's just magic of the video, it's still fascinating because it mimics a lot of the things that has happened and that people talk about when it comes to seeing the future.
Yes, and like you said, many stories and even many books, movies are inspired by this phenomena that people observe. Looking from that perspective, which of written sources or movies do you think are in line with the phenomena that people describe to you, with the stories that you've heard from real people?
It's really kind of amazing that there's this belief going around right now that we live in a type of matrix. We live in a simulation. And so, of course, the movie The Matrix helped that along. Many people believe that that's where it started, but it actually started with an author that I can't remember his name in the 60s and 70s. He wrote several sci-fi movies and then came up with this concept and this belief that we lived in a simulation. And so I think that's fascinating from a perspective of media and how that is put forward. Like I said, through the movie The Matrix, there's other movies out there that talk about the possibility that we live in a simulation. And I don't know if we live in a simulation, but I can definitely see how that might be a very big possibility. And the way that our media and movies and television shows kind of are feeding us that idea, you're wondering if people in the know aren't trying to slowly let us know, in the same way they do with UFOs, talking now a little bit about the military seeing UFOs and everything, and kind of just feeding us a little bit at a time. So I wonder if that's not kind of where we're sitting at, where we do live in a type of simulation. And that's the reason we have all of the paranormal things that we do, is because they're either a hiccup in the program or they've been put there on purpose for us to follow. So.
Mm-hmm. What is your favorite fantasy or sci-fi movie that talks about time slips?
So one of my favorites, it's kind of interesting. It's not necessarily a time slip per se. What it was a man who pulls out a old ham radio that was his father's and starts talking on the ham radio. And he starts talking to a guy on there. And as they talk back and forth, he realizes he's talking to his father who has passed away. And because he's talking to his dad in the past, they're able to prevent his mother's murder and work together with that. And so I love the idea of being able to talk to somebody in the past like that, and talk to somebody who's gone, who's passed away, a loved one like that. So that would have to be probably one of my favorites.
I have it for you and for our listeners. It's called Frequency.
Yes, Frequency. That's it.
Yes, was released in 2000 and about a son who communicates with his deceased father through a time-shifting radio, altering history.
Yep.
Yes.
That's a really good one.
Wonderful. Yes. And it reminds me about so-called magical artifacts these are certain devices that can help go through time or navigate through time, bend it, do something with it. And in this case, the son has this so-called magical artifact, which is the radio that he finds. Are you aware of any other magical artifacts, maybe
Yes.
myths, legends, or your experience with people who told you stories? What those other magical artifacts can be?
Yes. I'm going to jump in with one more movie that came to mind because I'm kind of a sap at heart. I love stories, but there's a movie called Somewhere in Time. It actually has Christopher Reeves in it. And it is a fantastic story about this young man who's an actor. And one night when he's acting, this older woman comes to him and hands him, I believe it's a pocket watch or something, and says, "Come back to me," is what she says. And he thought that was weird, and it really starts bothering him. So he hunts down where the pocket watch is from, and she's passed away. And he goes to this hotel and finds her picture, falls in love with her picture when she was young. And he actually learns how to time travel with his mind, and he's able to do it. He goes back in time to where she is. They meet, they fall in love. Everything's going great. But oddly enough, he had forgot one penny in his pants. He'd gotten an old suit, something that looked like an old suit and everything. He'd forgotten and put a penny that had the date from where he was from. And in the middle of nowhere, they finally have gotten together and they're in love. And he sees that penny, and the date draws him back to the future. And he's unable to travel back as hard as he wants to travel back in time. He can't.
Oh.
And he ends up dying of a broken heart. And then in the afterlife, they get to be together, which is phenomenal. It's called, I believe, Somewhere in Time is the name of that movie. And if your listeners get a chance to watch it, it's Somewhere in Time with Christopher Reeves, and the woman is Jane Seymour, I believe. And so that's a fantastic time slip, time travel type movie as well that isn't necessarily on anybody's radar, but if you love good love stories, that's definitely worth seeing. So,
Yes.
There is a lot of artifacts out there that seem to connect us to the past. And it's really amazing how different artifacts can do that. And even if it's just mentally drawing us back to that time, I've interviewed a lot of people who have found different artifacts that came along with visions of where it had come from. So they weren't necessarily slipping to the past, but I talked to a gentleman who loved collecting the Native American arrowheads. Different places in the West, you can still find them. They're hard to find now because of how many people have been looking. But he talked about picking one up, and he was so excited because it was really a good looking artifact. And he all of a sudden had a vision of a young man, young Native American, making his first bow. It was almost like it was right in front of him. And then it went away. And he's not the type of person who really necessarily believes in the paranormal. But he said it was so vivid that he picked it up and he was right there with him as he was making one of his first bows with an older gentleman. And the arrowheads were kind of spread out. They were making arrowheads in the bow. And even though it was very short, maybe 10 seconds or so, it really reiterated to him that these aren't just really cool artifacts. They're connected to people too. There's that connection. And so I really like that story for sure.
I also like this story because, of course, there are big artifacts like man-created time machines even. We have in many movies and whatnot. In this case of the movie you described, the artifact was that coin. Actually, it brought him back. It actually traveled him back home. But if we look just at our everyday life, we still can travel back in time just with our memories. We're taking different memorabilia.
Memorabilia, yes.
And looking at old pictures, looking at some gifts that somebody gave us. And that's why it's difficult for people, I think, to part with things because we want to have that connection
Yes.
and ability to travel and to connect with our past. But if we're talking about the past, like in this case with this arrowhead, which has that history, which has certain information that is attached to it, there are encounters and people are reporting that, yes, this can be if we touch or get in certain communication, certain things. And I think that is very valuable. So certain people are saying that even dressing in a costumes like we do in Renaissance fairs, at least here it's very popular. I don't know how it is in Utah, but in Florida it's popular. How is it in Utah? Yeah.
Yeah, they do have a big one here. Yeah. My wife, who's from Texas, said that they do great big ones there. I've always wanted to go to a big Renaissance fair. I think that would be amazing.
Yes. Yeah. So at those Renaissance fairs, especially when people dress, they start feeling that they are in those times. And some people get certain visions. They can be very brief, but if you really observe yourself, you can notice that, yes, something changed, something happened. And those people who believe in their past lives, sometimes this helps them remember them. Of course, we never know. We cannot know is this truth or not, but for those people, it is true. So they feel that it's real for them. And similar things when people are doing this role-playing historical battles and whatnot, that also brings people into that atmosphere of the past, which starts reminding them of things. What do you think about this? And maybe you talk to some people who experience this by using this type of artifacts. So
one of the things that's, at least when I was younger, was really big here in Utah, they had what was called the Rendezvous, which was a weekend long. And like the Renaissance Fair, they dressed up like back in the time in the 1800s when the fur companies would come out west and set up a big camp, and then all of the fur traders and the natives would come to bring in their beaver pelts and some of the stuff they had to trade. They would spend a week in this big camp with everybody trading and drinking and having parties, and it was called a rendezvous. And they would recreate that. They still do recreate that here. It's not as big as it used to be, but when you would walk down that, you'd walk in there, and the smell of the tanned hides and being able to see the wares just like back from the day, even as a kid, the feeling of being right back at that time was amazing, and it was so much fun. And I think there's also stories out there along the lines, especially at the Rendezvous, where there was a gentleman who was selling things at the Rendezvous, and he was dressed up like a mountain man. And he thought he knew everybody there because they're all part of a group. But this young man that was in buckskins and just decked out came through and was looking at his knives and everything. And he was talking to him, and he was like, "Oh, you really look good. You've done a good job." And he kind of looked at him funny and then walked off. But he almost seemed to disappear after leaving his booth, and nobody remembered him from anything else. And so to me, I was wondering if it was just like a spirit from back in the day that happened to wander through, and it looked so familiar that brought them into our reality. Or maybe it was somebody from the past that wandered in unknowingly into the future and didn't know it, and then was whisked back to his time. So something like that can definitely bring back feelings. It can entice that energy that could definitely bring people back and forth through that. So
what comes to my mind now also travels to different historical sites, visiting various museums. So it brings that atmosphere of the past that can transport basically you into those times. And one more thing that came to my mind, and I want to see what you think about it, is a watch. Yes, a watch was always and is still associated with time. And there are many movies when the person has a watch and this some type of mysterious watch that does this job of transporting a person into the past or into the future. I came up reading a story that had a watch that was going back. So it was bringing a person back in time, which was interesting, making a person younger as well. So what do you think about watches as an artifacts to transport people?
I really like the idea of that. I just love the idea because it does in itself symbolize time. I wish I could show you, but directly behind the camera here, I have a ship's clock that sits on the wall. And it was my grandfather's ship's clock. He was actually a maritime out of Denmark during World War II. And I have some of his stuff, but in particular, this ship's clock that hangs there. Now, it's been broken for years. It doesn't keep time anymore. Someday I wouldn't mind getting it in and try and get it fixed, but I'm just not even sure who would do that anymore. But what is amazing about it is that for no reason whatsoever, every once in a while, it'll just bing, even though you can't wind it up, you can't do anything. It'll just hit that sound that it used to have when it would hit the top of the hour. It would chime out the top of the hour, and it doesn't work, but it will still do that. And so I think it's amazing that somehow it's connecting to itself, maybe in the past when it worked, or there's something out there. Maybe it's my grandfather trying to tell me something. I do love the idea of watches and how it does connect us to time, because one of the fascinating things about time, and I tell my kids this all the time, that there's only one thing in this world that when it's gone, you can't get it back, and that's time. You can always make more money. You can always get more of anything out there. But one thing you can't get back is time if you waste it. So I just love the idea of a clock in and of itself, just because it's a symbol of that. And it's a symbol of the fact that nothing is permanent in this life. I know that's a little off topic from the paranormal, but it's a powerful message.
I agree. It's a very powerful message, and it also brought me immediately to all the stories of how people attempted to bend time, to stop time, to increase time, and their possibility to use this time on Earth to do certain things. So, but yes, like you said, it's a different story. It's a different topic on its own. There's so much associated with it, and time is very, very valuable. That's true. And now those sleeps in time that people talk to you about, some of them were very short, yes, like seconds, some of them longer, and people still needed to find their way out. Very interesting stories, I think, are reflected in myths, legends, fairy tales, especially, I think, in Ireland, in England, where the person was, let's say, going into the woods, coming back, and 200 years passed. At the best, 7 or 8 years. So that's, I think, was the shortest one. What do you think about those huge time lapse? And again, we're discovering different perspectives. Yes, we're not talking science, no science. No, we're looking from different standpoints. What are those time sleeps? What can be the meaning behind it? Why are they needed? What is your take on that?
I absolutely love the stories of when it comes to folklore and talking about not to follow anybody into the woods, especially into a building in the woods that you don't know, because there's a lot of stories through folklore of people who were wandering in the woods and came across a cabin where they're having a party in the cabin, and they decide to go in and they spend the night partying with these people, and they look like normal people, but in reality, they're the Fae. And they party until morning, and then they leave, only to return to town to find out, like you said, years have passed, and just years and years have passed. What I think's cool is that those stories that came from the Fae and they came from our history talk about how for them it was just a short amount of time that they were at the party, but a lot of time happened to their family, to the everything. And now we know that if you travel at the speed of light, say you went out at the speed of light and then came back, it would have only been a little while for you, but it would have been years and years for the people here on Earth. And so in folklore, they're talking about time dilation, which they had no idea about, that it is an actual thing if you traveled like that. So it makes me wonder with all of these stories, because I believe that, especially when it comes to folklore, they're trying to teach you something, but there's also a hint of truth to the stories, or in some cases, a lot of truth. So it makes me wonder if there aren't people who, when they do that, they're actually traveling to another dimension through, again, another portal, another place where time runs differently. It runs shorter or faster than it does here. Because that story come out in all different places of folklore all over the world. They have these very similar stories about that, about people who go to a party in a cabin in a woods that they come across. But it's universal all over the world, these stories, and warning people not to do it. And that's my biggest thought, is that the Fae, or those involved with the Fae, are somehow in another dimension that runs different than ours does. And they might think it's really funny to lure you in and then send you back at a different time when everybody else that you knew is old or dead. So it's funny.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm. It is. It is. And of course, it's an interesting explanation. For Faye, it might be just fun to do something like that. From another perspective, we can consider it as well. Maybe during those times, during those moments, while the person is with them, they are transferring certain knowledge that people are supposed to bring on Earth at that particular time, when they basically release them and they come and they can bring something new. So in a way, that's also maybe a possibility. And I came upon this interesting story on YouTube. It was a person, he said that he came from the future to specifically gather information, create museum with all that information, so that in the future they would have access to that information, to bring certain knowledge into one time domain or another. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's very fascinating. I love the idea of being able to go back and help people or gain that knowledge that people may need. As I've studied history and I've studied different things, one thing that stands out in my mind, the number of times during the Cold War that we almost came to destruction between the two countries, where they almost launched for mistakes, and how many things had to happen, just coincidences, to stop those things from happening. It makes me believe that whether it is somebody in the future or a divine being or something of just the universe that's directing, perhaps there is something that's guiding us and making sure that we don't destroy ourselves, that that humanity continues on. And I wonder if there isn't times where people have come from the future to stop certain events from happening, but they don't announce it, so we never knew what it was. There's many stories about during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, there was a gentleman there. He demanded that his name not be written down or anything, but there were several times that they became stuck on what they were trying to figure out with the Declaration, with everything. And he would just give them a nudge and tell them this or that and help them along to get the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and everything written perfectly. But he demanded that he not be added to any of the writings about it or anything. But still, that leaked out a few things, that somebody was there that was helping them along when they would get stuck. And to me, that very well may be somebody from the future that came back to make sure everything ran right. But who knows? I just love stories like that because it does lend to the fact that time travel is possible, or it will be at one point. And I guess if it is possible, then it is now. But anyway, yeah.
Yes, and that's what our podcast is about. It's creative exploration, so we can definitely look at things from all kinds of various perspectives, imagine things. It's our absolute right to do it here. And what I think we came to right now is to certain functions that people or beings are performing by using all this time bending, sleeping, going through time. In magical professions, I imagine, and again, we're imagining that there is a world that is invisible, but it is out there and it penetrates our world. And maybe there are different worlds and they penetrate each other, but something magical works, like you said, with magical force. And because of that, there are also people who work in magical professions in those worlds. And some of them might be just doing certain jobs right there in those worlds, but some of them might be doing something in between our worlds. Yes, so connecting, bringing information here, sending information to other places. So in this case, what functions do you think people who are related to time travel perform? Like some we already mentioned, yes, it might be guiding us, like with this Declaration of Independence, providing guidance. What else can it be, in your opinion?
I think that there could be any number of things that they could do. And the reason that they are I don't know if you would call it interfering, but necessarily maybe fixing when they come back through time. The whole concept of people being able to come back and change things in the past, to me, it's fascinating. I know that personally, if I had the power to go back in time, I would love to go back and just see, for example, there's a lot of argument about how they built the pyramids. And I would love to just go back and see how they actually did that to fix that, or, to figure that out. So I wouldn't necessarily be changing anything, but just increasing my knowledge. And so I wonder if there isn't a certain section of those time travelers, if they're out there, are simply observing because they want to see how it matches up with their beliefs in the future. How did people in the year 2000s start doing computer stuff? How did they work the internet? Because it's not so much there. Or how did World War II really start, and kind of observe that? Because I think that one of the things, at least that I love so much, is history, because it helps me understand who I am a little bit, especially if I do genealogy. And so I think that if they're time traveling, they're definitely doing some things to maybe help out and figure out and maybe fix. But I wonder if a vast majority of it isn't just to study the past and maybe us, or even further in the past, and figure out humanity. Because if they're coming from way in the future, it's going to be a lot different than we are now, or even further in the past. Because when we study the past, we are often shocked at some of the things that our ancestors did. And I'm sure there's things we're doing right now that are shocking the people in the future that would be like, I can't believe they would do that. And they're trying to understand. And well, what a better way to understand the past than to go back and kind of live it or view it first person. If that makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. And there is a very interesting book by brothers Strugatsky, It's called Hard to be a God. Сложно быть Богом. It's in Russian. It's about those observers who go into the past to observe how people live. But there are very important limitations that are imposed on those people. They can observe, like you said, for historical references to know exactly what happened, but they cannot interfere. And that's the hardest part, because they're already developed. They live in a completely different world. And if they, let's say, get into the Middle Ages, where they see people burning other people, for their knowledge, for their interest, or just because somebody didn't like a neighbor who did some various atrocities. And how can you still be neutral to things like that? So, so that topic definitely is being explored by authors, by people. You are right on top of it, and thank you for this reminder of this topic.
Yes. It reminds me, too, of another topic, which is along those lines of the thought that there's several stories through history and some stories even that I've collected where people have had interactions with individuals who they really give off this feeling, or they come out right out and say it, that they have been alive for thousands and thousands of years. For whatever reason, they're able to do that. And so that they have seen humanity come along all the way. They've lost loved ones, and yet they still look fairly young, but they somehow are able to live through all of those times. And so it's the same kind of thing. They can't necessarily go back in time, but they've been able to view things from far back. I think those stories are really fascinating too, because there's several of those stories through history too, of people that supposedly show up every so many centuries and they look the same. And there's a count in particular, and I wish I could remember, I apologize, I'm terrible with names, that supposedly showed up every so many centuries, and he had that knowledge from living through the French Revolution and all of these things. It's just really fascinating. I love that kind of stuff.
Yes, and I remember some of the legends. I think Irish legends talk about that. I think it's a fish. I think it was salmon. But it was the one that was observing everything that was going on, because there were different tribes that were living and changing. One was changing another, and all this history was happening. And the salmon, he was actually the person who was observing and keeping all those historical records of what was happening. So it's a myth, but it's in line with what you were just saying. So there are those accounts, and why not? They might be very real, that there are people, beings that are keeping that history record of things that are happening. But the most difficult part is not to get involved. Yes, and that's a part of being a historian. You need to be very objective to things. You cannot really take one side or another side. You need to record what is happening, and that's the most difficult part of it, I think. And here we come to the topic of what qualities those time travelers, timeline observers should possess to be suitable for this type of magical job. What do you think?
I think one of the ones that we kind of touched on was the fact that you have to be able to observe and not interact, or not let your emotions get involved when it comes to certain things. So I'm a big sci-fi fan, and I remember there were several Star Trek episodes where they went back in time. One of the original series, they went back in time, and the Doctor falls in love with this woman, but according to history, she has to die. And then he doesn't want her to die, but it's all tied into history. And at the very end, they stop him from saving her, and she gets hit by the car and dies. And that's one quality I think that would be hard, like you said. is to be able to just observe and not intervene, because you really don't know what kind of ripples you would cause through time. A short story that I happen to like is called The Sound of Thunder, and it's about these gentlemen. They have time travel, but they can only go back in time, and they hunt the dinosaurs that are about to die. They can't hunt anything except for the ones that are about to die. And they have to travel on these paths that they make above the ground so they don't interfere with the ground or anything like that. Well, when they're back there, something goes wrong, and one of the guys steps on a butterfly, and they don't think much of it. But when they get back, it's changed. Instead of living in a democracy, they now live in a very evil future where there's a guy in charge that is like Hitler of theirs, and they've changed time just by stepping on a butterfly that far back. So it's kind of amazing. You'd have to have one quality, like I said, you'd have to be able to do it without interfering. Two, you'd have to have a great deal of knowledge, at least the knowledge that you do have of the past, so that you don't change things or understand what's going on. And just be very observant, I think, and be able to document everything that you witness.
Yeah. Yes, and what you were talking about is that butterfly effect, that even the smallest thing that is changed can lead to huge effects that you even wouldn't think that can happen. Yeah, very interesting. And my next question is, because we have all these magical professions related to time, and there are different ones we already also explored, that there can be different and they can use different artifacts. And again, it's explorative, creative thinking. There should be some guides, somebody who support these processes, who takes care of these processes. Yes, hierarchically, maybe a little higher with the broader knowledge and providing those powers to people. Who do you think from, again, different gods, from different pantheons, wherever they are, or from other beings, who can they be? Who can provide this function of overlooking at time travelers or time benders?
I think that it would require somebody with God-like knowledge, somebody who has all of the knowledge and is able to guide that. Even with time travelers, there has to be someone in charge of the rules to not allow just anybody to go messing with time. And I like the idea of a higher power, whether you would call that God, whether you would call that the universe itself or something of that nature, that's just in charge of that, kind of in charge of what you can and can't change, or what you can and can't do. And it's almost like living here, but on a higher plane, in the fact that there's always consequences to your actions. And sometimes people have to learn that the hard way. And perhaps that's the same thing with time travelers. Maybe perhaps they end up learning certain things the hard way. But I would definitely say it would have to be someone with the knowledge of a god, or someone with the experience, perhaps somebody, the original person who was able to go through all of this, the original time traveler that's learned all of these lessons to begin with, and they have to guide people or not allow things. And just like in nature, there is hard rules. Maybe there's hard rules when it comes to time travel.
Yes, that's possible. And I like your idea. It might be the initial time traveler that got all this experience, and now he knows about other time travelers and can instruct. I love this idea. That's number one. If these are people in the future who learned how to work with time, those can be them. It can be God-like creature. We know from, let's say, Greek mythology, Cronus, yes, who is responsible for time. That is a possible option as well. So there are certain beings, like you said, Fae. I think they mastered this time-bending machine because they were able to bring people, bring them back, and do things in time. And of course, if we look through different sci-fi, like you said, I have this book. It's Clifford Simak. He is a classic of sci-fi. And here are the flowers who learned the time bending from another nation. So it might be some alien nations that already mastered that, and they have already established the process and they can guide other people. And then they transfer this knowledge to plants. And these plants now know how to do this, and they have the whole network, like neural network that does the thing. So there are different things that can be. So through our conversation, again, imaginative, we are creatively looking at things. We see the whole network of possible time distortions, time changes, time travel, time slips, and possible people who oversee it, and certain rules, and certain people that have certain characteristics and that help them to be within this network and knowingly or unknowingly participate in it. So maybe you also, from your perspective, can summarize the picture of working with time in general.
Yes, we often think of time as a river that runs, and we're on the river and going down. And the more that I learn and the more that I study, the more I understand that it's a lot more complex than that, and that time travel is very possible, I believe. But even though I can't say that from a physics standpoint, I can say that from a how I feel standpoint, meaning listening to people and all of these things. The one thing that I always want to try and convey to people is that the world and the universe and time is just a beautiful thing that you have to allow unfold in front of you. You have to have belief in magic. You have to belief in these things, and how much better the world is when we can open ourselves up to any possibility when we walk out our door. And then hopefully maybe the universe will expose some of that to us, including time and time travel.
Yes. So you noted, I think, very important quality. It's the openness. Yes. The open mind and looking at the universe, at the world around and inside us with open mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for that. And from the perspective of this magical world, magical professions that penetrates, our world, and we communicate with it, what do you think is your role, is your function? Gathering all the stories, putting them all in perspective, classifying in a way. What do you think?
I consider myself a storyteller. Mm-hmm. I think that storytelling goes back to when our ancestors were sitting around the fire at the end of the day, and the older people were telling stories about things that had happened throughout and keeping history alive. And I think that that is very important these days. I look at myself as a storyteller of the paranormal. I keep the world of the unknown alive, mm-hmm. and try and help people understand that, mm-hmm. and maybe open their mind to that a little bit. That's what I kind of hope that I am, is a storyteller of the unknown.
Of the unknown. Beautiful. And what are your next steps? Where are you heading? What are your plans in this storytelling of unknown?
So right now I actually am working on 2 books. Both of them should be out this year. I'm finishing up Stranger Idaho, which will be all different firsthand paranormal stories from Idaho. And also I'm releasing a book later this year. It's got a long title. It's called Stranger Bridgerland Field Guide to the Paranormal, where mm-hmm. I talk about all the different entities and different experiences and kind of try and classify them and help people understand them a little bit better. So it's kind of like a field guide for that. And next week, I've been invited to speak at Utah Valley University here in Utah. at the Folklore Symposium and talking about why we love the paranormal and the unknown. And then you can look me up on my website, strangerbridgerland.com, and that will help you if your listeners want to hear me speak my upcoming speaking engagements through the year. So,
yes, that was my next question. How can we learn more about what you do and also get in touch with you if people have stories that they want to bring to you?
yes.
What would be the best way to do it?
Yes, you can contact me at the strangerbridgerland.com. Look up strangerbridgerland.com and you can contact me through there. I'm always happy to hear new stories and interview people. I absolutely love that. And that's how I'm getting a lot of my stories is through there. And all of my books, the Stranger Bridgerland book series, are available on Amazon or Kindle or audiobook. So your listeners can find all of those under Stranger Bridgerland book series.
Excellent. And as we're ending our podcast, we discussed many interesting questions. Maybe there is one question that we didn't cover, but you would like to talk about that. That's now the best time to do it.
I have so many that I love talking about, but I'd love to do just an overview of all of the stories I collect. I say they're all the paranormal, but I've interviewed and written about the glitches in the Matrix, like we talked about, ghost stories, cryptids, which involve Bigfoot and other cryptids, UFOs, pretty much anything when it comes to the paranormal, I've written about and studied about. So I could go on for hours and hours about any one of those topics, but I just love to let your listeners know that, reiterate that if they have stories of their own, I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to hear back about if anybody has read my book, what they thought. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come on today and talk with you and explore time travel.
Yes, it was absolutely amazing. I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much, John. And of course, I wish you all the best in your storytelling of unknown. I'm looking forward to reading your books and hopefully having you in the future again on our podcast. Maybe you will be able to give the broad overview of the topics that you studied already. So to provide that perspective of you as a storyteller of unknown in general. So I hope that we can do it as well. So thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you.
Dear listeners, I hope you found our Magical Professions podcast episode insightful. As we concluded, I'd like to extend a heartfelt invitation to all of you. Your stories, encounters, and knowledge are invaluable to us, and we want you to be a part of this mystical journey. Have you ever had a brush with a magical profession, a strange encounter, or stumbled upon hidden knowledge? Do you possess ancient scrolls, widespread tales, or first hand experiences that you believe belong in the spotlight? Are you aware of a sci fi or fantasy book or a movie with magical professionals in it? We want to hear from you. At Magical Professions, we cherish the power of collective wisdom and the magic of shared experiences. So don't be shy. Reach out to us with your stories, sources, or any information about magical professions you would like to share. You can connect with us via email at magicalprofessions@gmail.com or through our social media channels. Your contribution could become the heart of a future episode, and together we'll weave an even richer tapestry of wonder. Thank you for joining us on this mystical journey. Remember, the magic is not just in the stories we tell, but in the connections we make. Until next time, keep the magic alive, and may your world be ever more enchanting. I can't wait to hear from you.